So I'm recording the rest of the lecture that I was not able to complete the other day, and then I'll be uploading the same. So we were discussing about theft by servant, and we found that even in case of theft by servant, the master is held liable if the same act is conducted in the course of employment. Now, what about when the master, puts the servant, to some work, okay, uh, under the employment for which the servant has been kept, but the servant then negligently delegates that authority to someone else. What about those situations? Would the master still be liable because the servant was not authorized to delegate it to anyone else? So, yes, even in this situation, okay, as you would probably rightly predict, the master is held liable. So, we have a case by the name Ricketts versus Thomas Tilling Limited. In this particular case, the driver was authorized to drive a bus. When he felt tired, he asked the conductor to drive the bus for some time. The conductor was, negligent in driving the bus, and as a consequence, he hurt a pedestrian. So, in this particular case, it was held that the master was liable for negligence on the part of the driver in allowing conductor to drive negligently. So, even in those situations where there is negligent delegation of the duty of the authority by the servant to someone else, the master can still be held liable. So the next important problem arises is when so a master has a servant, okay, and when the servant is lent to someone else by the master, and when the servant acts, after he or she has been lent and acts up committing a wrong, acts up committing a tort, who would be liable? The master who has lent the servant, or the person under whom the servant was currently working? So when a servant is lent out, okay, to another person, then the master who still controls the activities of the servant and not just merely directs his actions will be the one who is liable. So the control test comes to our rescue, okay? So whoever is in fact controlling the actions of the servant would be the one who would be liable. So masters lends out the servant to some other person, okay? That master who has the control over the activities of the servant, okay, and not the one who merely directs the action, okay. So you do this, no, not the one, okay. So for example, I lend my servant to B, okay, but if I am the one who's actually guiding, controlling how the activity is to be done, then I'll be held responsible, not the person to whom I have lent the servant, okay. But if it is the person to whom I have lent my servant is the one who's directing and controlling the activities of the servant, okay, then it will be the person who has been lent to would be the one who will be responsible. So in order to determine the liability, as to who has the liability, okay, in such cases, certain things are to be kept in mind, okay. So these are pointers, these will be guides for you to determine who's responsible. So you start with who pays the servant, okay, who pays the servant for the particular job, that can tell you, okay, who has the opportunity to supervise the work of the servant. So that tells you the kind of control, okay, who has actual control. Who has the power to punish or dismiss the servant? Well, that also tells you clearly who has control over the servant. And what machinery is used. Machinery, if it is only the servant who has been taken, and the machinery is of the person who to whom the servant has been lent, okay, then the presumption would be that, well, now the servant is working under that person. But if the machinery of the original master is used, then you'd raise the presumption that, well, yeah. So all these factors, not just one, all these factors have to be kept in mind. So specific fact situations will tell the judges as to who's actually in control, and that will determine who, who should be held liable in such case. So if the original master withdraws the control, okay, and supervision over his servant at the time of lending, the new master is liable for the tort committed by the servant. So the control test is the one that helps us, along with other factors that we have already discussed. So in this regard, we have a very important case by the name Mercy Docks and Harbour Board versus Coggins and Griffith Liverpool Limited. This is a very important case in this regard. Okay, the facts of the case are that the appellants let out their crane. Okay, so remember, they let out not just the servant, okay, the crane, as well as the driver, the servant, to the respondent's stevedores, okay, under a contract providing that the driver shall be the servant of the respondent. Okay, so the contract says that the driver shall be the servant of the respondent. The crane driver now, by his negligence, injured a person, giving rise to the question as to who was the master at the time of the accident, whether the person to whom it has been lent or the person who has let out. So all the courts held that there was no transfer of the servant, and the appellants continued to be the master and were therefore held liable for the negligence of the servant. So remember one factor: whose tools, instruments, machineries are being used. Okay, so you see clearly in this particular case that the original master's crane was being used, raising the presumption that the servant was still under the control of the original one. So Lord Porter in the House of Lords pointed out that an arrangement for transfer of the services of the servant from one master to another can take place only with his express or implied consent, and that it is not legitimate to infer that a change of masters has been effected because a contract has been made between the two employers declaring whose servant the man employed shall be at the particular moment in the course of his general employment by one of the two. Then he observed that the most satisfactory test by which to ascertain who is the employer at any particular time is to ask who is still entitled to tell the employee the way in which he is to do the work upon which he is engaged. So who has the control, as we discussed. If someone other than his general employer is authorized to do this, he will, as a rule, be the person liable for the employee's negligence. But it is not enough that the task to be performed should be under his control. He must also control the method of performing it. It is true that in most cases there are no orders as to how the job should be done. Where a man driving a mechanical device such as a crane is sent to perform a task, it is easier to infer that the general employer continues to control the method of performance. So the tool, the instrument, the machinery is helping us who's in control. Since it is his crane and the driver remains responsible to him for its safekeeping. So in the present case, if the appellant's contention were to prevail, the crane driver would change his employer each time he embarked on the discharge of a fresh ship. So anyway, so you see that the machinery, the instruments, okay, help the judges in identifying under whose effective control the servant was working. So yes, that's how we identify. Okay, so in case some servant has been lent. Now earlier we discussed that when there is an instruction that something is to be avoided, but if the servant nonetheless negligently does it, okay, then we found that the master is still held liable. So we have seen that already. So carelessness of a servant, okay, even when there is a direction to the country, would still make the master liable. But what if the master expressly, okay, not just as a matter of general instructions, but expressly prohibits someone from doing something, okay? the servant from doing something. What happens in that case? So you would probably have some idea as to what will be held. Is it not possible for the master in any way at all to avoid responsibility for what the servant does? Well, this is one of those situations. If there is an express prohibition, okay, of a certain act, that this is exactly what you will not do, okay, do not do this, okay, by the master, then the master cannot be held liable. So the first case, okay, if it is of general nature, then the master is held liable. We have discussed it in the case of Limpus versus London General Omnibus Company. But in Twine versus Bean Express Limited, okay, Twine versus Bean Express Limited, in this particular case, it was held otherwise because there was express prohibition. So in this particular case, the driver was expressly prohibited to give lift to anyone, and the notice was also affixed to the cab which was being driven. Still the driver, okay, so there was express prohibition that no one is to be allowed, okay, on the cab, okay, and there was also a notice which was affixed to the cab, okay. Still the driver allowed a person to travel who was killed in consequence of driver's negligence. It was held that the act of giving lift by the driver to an unauthorized person fell outside the course of employment, and the master was not liable. So you see quite often, you see these yellow school buses on which it's clearly written it's only for the commutation of the pupils, and it might even clearly write that, okay, no one else is to be allowed on board, okay. So, and the driver might also have been clearly instructed not to let anyone else board, okay. In such case, if the driver nonetheless lets someone on board, okay, and then there is an accident as a consequence, the concerned person suffers, then the master cannot be held liable if there is express prohibition with a notice affixed to the said vehicle. So that's the case. But otherwise, if the instructions are general, then the decision would be otherwise. So the third situation would be incidental acts. Okay, the first situation is authorized, then the second one is unauthorized way of doing that which is authorized, and the third situation is incidental act. So it's not the directly authorized act, but something that comes out of it, okay, directly related to that which is authorized. It's like incidental to, not the authorized act, but it happens due to the authorized act, okay. In those situations, what happens? So we have a case by the name Canada Pacific Railway Company versus Lockhart, okay. In this case, the defendant company instructed its servants not to use uninsured vehicles on company's business, okay. So the defendant company instructed servants, okay, not to use uninsured vehicles on the company's business. So once the defendant servant had to use, an uninsured vehicle, maybe no other vehicle was available, incidentally to attend some repair on company's business, okay. The repair was to be done on behalf of the company. And while the uninsured vehicle was being used for the said purpose, an accident happened, okay. In this particular case, the defendant was held liable since the use of the uninsured vehicle was incidental to the primary function for which the servant was employed. So yes, even with respect to incidental acts, the servant can be held liable for master can be held liable for what the servant does. Now there are certain exceptions, as you would have already seen, okay. So the first would be that yes, not every act of the servant would make the master liable. It's only those which is conducted within the course of employment. But if something is done outside the course of employment, then the master cannot be held liable. Now the Other example would be, we have just discussed, lending of a servant. If the lending of a servant happens with delegation, with, also handing over effective control of direction and etc., then the master is not liable, but the new master under whom the servant is working would be held liable. There are many other things that could also be discussed, but one very important thing is that your this idea of vicarious liability. Okay, when it comes to strict liability, if you remember, we have discussed Rylance versus Fletcher. Okay, in which the act of digging was done by done by not by servants but independent contractors. Okay, so in case of strict liability, okay, the fact that someone, and some independent contractor has done something, okay, not the not a servant, that would not be an exception. Okay, so even if it is not done by the servant but by some independent contractor, okay, even in that situation the master can be held liable. Now there are other situations, okay, where the master could also be held liable. I mean, there are many other things. I think this should suffice for now. So these are the situations in which master is held liable for the acts of the servant. So usually, so the broad idea is that usually it is only for the servant's act that the master is held liable, but there are other situations where someone can be held liable even if it is not a servant. Okay, even if the act has been done by, for example, your independent contractor. Even then, even if that master servant relation does not exist, one can still be held liable. So there could be many other examples of that. Okay, so when you authorize someone to do something that is illegal, unlawful, okay, even in those situations, the person who has authorized, okay, even if it is not of the nature of a master and servant, the person who has authorized can nonetheless be held liable. So yes, there are many other examples that we can take up, but this should suffice, and that would be the end of this particular topic. So next we will start the topic of nuisance. So yes, nuisance is another very interesting topic for a student of law taught. So what does nuisance mean? So nuisance, let's see how it is defined generally. Okay, so Oxford Dictionary defines it as a it talks about first as, okay, as a noun, so that's not our concern, but as in in law, how has it defined there? Okay, an act which is harmful or offensive to the public or a member of it, for which there is a legal remedy. An act which is harmful and offensive to the public. Okay, this is how they define. But so let's look at a couple of more definitions. Oh. Hello. Mm-hmm. Hi.